Se você está acompanhando a novela da Activision Blizzard e já está cansado de esperar sobre as novidades da aprovação final, fiquem tranquilos que dessa vez a coisa andou e muito bem. Temos a pré-aprovação do CMA lá do Reino Unido e é sobre isso que vamos falar hoje. Vem comigo que eu te conto. Salve senhores, salve senhoras, LEOIZZO na área, e é exatamente sobre a pré-aprovação do CMA que vamos falar hoje. Algo muito importante que já estava aguardado por todo mundo que está acompanhando a compra da Activision Blizzard pela Microsoft. Nesta semana, o regulador do Reino Unido soltou a sua pré-avaliação baseado na nova proposta que a Microsoft tinha apresentado, onde os direitos de negociação dos jogos da Activision Blizzard em nuvem vão estar na mão da Ubisoft e não da Microsoft, e nesse caso atendeu às expectativas do CMA como um todo. Durante o dia, ontem, sexta-feira, quando a coisa realmente desenrolou, nós tivemos aí vários executivos da Microsoft, como o próprio Phil Spencer e o Brad Smith, comentando, mandando suas mensagens no Twitter, realmente elogiando a posição do CMA e dizendo que realmente isso é fruto de um trabalho muito grande, muito importante que vem sendo feito para a compra da Activision Blizzard. Lulu Chang também, da Activision Blizzard, comentou, Bob Kotick, também presidente da Activision Blizzard, comentou também sobre isso, mas o principal ficou por conta de duas grandes entrevistas que tivemos no dia de ontem. De um lado, tivemos aí Yahoo Finance, um dos maiores canais de negócios do mundo, e seus especialistas comentando sobre a decisão do CMA e também suas opiniões, algo que a gente vai comentar daqui a pouquinho. E do outro, a Bloomberg, que entrevistou Sarah Cordell, a executiva CEO do CMA, onde, num vídeo de 8 minutos, ela falou muita coisa importante, muita coisa legal. Então, que tal a gente começar assistindo os vídeos e eu comento eles na sequência?
Microsoft announcing a new deal today to get its $69 billion bid for Activision Blizzard past UK regulators. Yahoo Finance's Dan Howley and Alexis Keenan are here to break down the story. Dan, let's start with you. So talk to us about what's in this refreshed deal.
Yeah, so the deal basically is separate from what's going on in the EU, and what this calls for is for rival Ubisoft to get access to Activision Blizzard's games in the cloud. So it doesn't have to do with the console specifically, it's about cloud gaming, and that would seem to be the UK's biggest concern. Now, what that means is that they would be licensed to Ubisoft. They would have access to Activision Blizzard's titles, their exclusives, and then Microsoft and others would be able to license it from there. Ubisoft does have its own cloud platform, but it's not as big as Microsoft's, and so now we're going to see Ubisoft essentially relicense things back to Microsoft after they pay Microsoft to get access to them. So it's kind of this weird circular logic going on here. But at the end of the day, Microsoft and Activision Blizzard seem to think that it'll satisfy regulators in the UK.
What do you think, Alexis? Do you think it's going to satisfy regulators?
That is a maybe right now. Now, this could end the global challenges that have been brought against this deal, but that just leaves the U.S. as a big question mark here, because now the U.K. is the only country left still challenging this accord after the U.S. had withdrawn its FTC litigation. That one was retracted by the FTC after an appellate court in the United States said it would not pause the deal, so it doesn't have the legal authority to stop it. But look, that doesn't mean that the FTC can't still go after this deal, can't challenge it. That brings in the DOJ too. They have the right to bring a suit. And look, these antitrust actions, they can be brought after even a deal is closed, so it may make sense for Microsoft and Activision to get the blessing of the U.S. authorities, but right now that's not in play. We've reached out to the FTC. They are not commenting on whether or not this UK sort of re-proposal will change its thinking along these lines. So far, we have 40 countries approximately that have okayed this deal. So yeah, leaving the big question mark here in the US.
All right, another question mark, gamers. Dan, we haven't talked about them. What does this mean for them?
Yeah, it could be a good thing for gamers, because part of this means that Sony will also get access to these Activision Blizzard titles through Ubisoft. And again, this is it's just, a wild kind of roundabout way of getting over the UK's issues. But Sony players would be able to get access to them. NVIDIA players would be able to get access to them. And this is all via the cloud. So it just means that there would be more choice for gamers to get access to these Activision Blizzard games. It also means that mobile gamers would likely get more access. And I think that's really where Microsoft is trying to head here. Mobile gaming is growing faster. It also is an area where gamers who don't have high-end PCs, don't have even regular PCs, rely on their smartphone, they can get access to these high-end games through Microsoft's Game Pass. And so that's really kind of where the idea for this goes for Microsoft. Get more people hooked through mobile. Sony doesn't really do that. Ubisoft doesn't really do that. NVIDIA can do that. Any of these services can do that, but Microsoft is really focusing on it. And that's kind of the end-all, be-all for them with this deal. So I think that, yes, it's very good for consumers across the board if they're able to access these games from the service of their choice. But then for Microsoft, it also helps to preserve that mobile element that's so important to them.
Nesse primeiro vídeo do Yahoo Finance, a gente viu que é um vídeo bem rápido, onde existem comentários mais técnicos. De um lado, o especialista, né, o rapaz estava comentando bem, né, a respeito do que aconteceu e também falando que na visão dele, ele realmente entende que isso é bom para os gamers. Do outro lado, a especialista, a mocinha que estava comentando, ela fala de um jeito, ela levou o comentário do CMA pro FTC, meio que desafiando o FTC. Ficou meio estranha a posição dela, não sabemos, não dá para entender muito bem aonde ela estava querendo chegar com essa pontuação, mas de qualquer forma é um vídeo bem bacana do Yahoo Finance que demonstrou ali como o mercado realmente tá esperando que a coisa aconteça, realmente é positivo e a coisa vai para frente numa jogada ali que a Microsoft teve que fazer de última forma para que a coisa acontecesse do jeito que eles precisavam e não do jeito que eles queriam.
All right, we are here with Sarah Cardell, the CEO of the CMA. On a day that is pretty historic, you are now seeing them clear the final hurdle for Microsoft and their $69 billion acquisition of Activision Blizzard. So again, a pleasure to have Sarah here. Sarah, let's start with the final approval here. It looks like there might still be a few steps before we get to that clearance on October 18th. What's left?
Yeah, so what we have here, just perhaps to recap for a minute, you'll recall that last month we confirmed the prohibition of the original proposed acquisition between Microsoft and Activision. And Microsoft then took that away. They came back with a substantially revised transaction. And if you recall, our concerns are all about cloud gaming. And our concern was about the combination of Microsoft's really strong position in cloud across Xbox and across its Windows operating system, and combining that with Activision's gaming content. Now, what Microsoft have done is to quite substantially restructure that deal. And importantly, they've put those cloud streaming rights in relation to all of Activision's content in the hands of a third-party independent competitor, Ubisoft. So that substantially resolves the original concerns that we had. What we're left with is some limited residual concerns, which are really about making sure that the terms of that deal with Ubisoft are absolutely watertight. So what Microsoft have proposed is that the CMA will effectively have a kind of backstop power to be able to enforce directly those terms of that deal with Ubisoft if we needed to. Yeah. Very much hope that wouldn't be necessary. And that's the bit that we're consulting on today. That's the sort of final step, as you say, ahead of the final decision, which needs to be taken by the 18th of October. But we're confident, based on what we've seen now, that this is a package which resolves the original concerns that we identified.
The language you use is really interesting because moving forward from this deal, you and your colleagues have said that in the future for deals coming through, to really offer these revised structural changes right at the get-go, no really long process. Does that imply that the CMA won't be accepting those revised structural remedies?
Look, as we said, it is always open to emerging parties to decide to restructure the way that they're organising the deal. But frankly, this restructure could have been put forward to the CMA as part of our original process. And that is a far better way to operate, both for us as the agency, but also for the emerging business. What we've seen as a result is delays, costs, and frankly, my advice to any businesses watching this would be, if you think that you have a solution that addresses our concerns fully and comprehensively, put that forward early in the process. Let us engage on that and don't hold that back.
I think the key words there being a long and costly process. Sarah, you feels like the CMA has really put their foot down in a way that perhaps the EU and the US regulatory authorities have not been able to. Do you feel like the CMA has really moved the needle in regulating tech around the world?
We are concerned to ensure that competition in these markets, we've talked about cloud gaming before, it's a nascent but rapidly developing market. And it's a great example of a tech market where it's critical to keep this open to vibrant competition to promote innovation and choice. And that, whether that's in merger control or in other areas, that's our objective. So we've been clear and consistent here that this deal could only go through provided we were confident that open and effective competitive market would be preserved. And that is, I think, an important message to take away from this deal on our approach more generally to competition in digital and tech markets.
In analysis of this deal, there was a lot of criticism, perhaps, and perhaps this applies more to Microsoft than the CMA, that ultimately the remedy included a French company at a time when the UK broadly is, to your point, trying to increase competition within its borders. Do you feel like this kind of scrutiny, this long process with Microsoft, has discouraged others from coming forward to working with the CMA?
So I think for us, it's not really about which country the company is in. It's about making sure the dynamics of competition are really great. And actually, by putting the cloud streaming rights in the hands of Ubisoft will be able to provide that content not just direct to consumers, but also to supply it to a whole host of different cloud gaming providers, from a number of different countries. It's a global deal with Ubisoft, and it really opens up the market to other cloud streaming providers to be able to provide cloud gaming, using a variety of different models, subscription models, non-Windows operating systems. So I think that it opens up a lot of potential, not just for Ubisoft, but for a number of different cloud gaming providers going forward.
Looking at the nitty-gritty and how this deal was actually structured, of course, we know Microsoft gave several proposals to the CMA. There was also a thought that perhaps the CMA has some sort of lack of wanting for a licensing deal, for lack of a better term. Basically, that a licensing deal would be an automatic no from the CMA. Is that true?
So our concern with this transaction and with the original proposals that came through from Microsoft earlier in the process was to make sure that Microsoft didn't retain control of the distribution of this cloud content. Because, as I say, the concern with the merger at the outset was the combination of Microsoft's already strong position in cloud with Activision's games and the impact of bringing those two together. So where we had originally proposals where Microsoft was going to be licensing that directly to individual companies, it didn't really sever that link. It was still very much Microsoft licensing that on terms to which for individual companies. What we have here, as I say now, is a divestment, an upfront divestment of those cloud streaming rights in relation to all of Activision's content, not just the content that exists now, but the content that will be created over the next 15 years. And that is an upfront divestment of that package of cloud streaming rights to a third party. And it really severs that link. It breaks the control that Microsoft will have over the way in which that cloud content will then be distributed. And that is really important to address our concerns.
So to be clear, a licensing deal is still on the table for other deals down the road?
We look at each individual transaction on its merits. There are very good reasons why we are cautious about behavioral remedies generally, and that would include licensing deals. So I wouldn't look at this certainly as a licensing deal. From my perspective, this is very much about divestment of an entire sort of operation in terms of distribution of cloud streaming, and that divestment upfront, which is severing that link and maintaining Ubisoft, effectively putting Ubisoft back in the position of Activision if the merger hadn't gone ahead. Of course, the content creation remains with Activision, but the ability for Ubisoft now to take independent decisions about how that content is then distributed through third parties. So we know sort of previously Microsoft could control and limit the distribution channels, for example. That doesn't happen now. That's all within the unilateral control of Ubisoft. And that is a very different perspective.
Sarah Cardell, a pleasure to have you walk us through the details of what will be a historic deal for the gaming space. We thank you, as always, the CEO of the Competition and Markets Authority there for the UK.
Vídeo maravilhoso da Bloomberg com a Sarah Cardell, a CEO do CMA, que a gente tá, né, aqui, aliás, é Sarah Connor de um lado e a Lina Ken do outro lado do FTC, ninguém gosta delas, mas pelo outro lado, dessa vez, ela comentou coisas bem bacanas. Primeiro que ela falou mais de uma vez que ela está feliz, o CMA está bem confiante e realmente gostou do que foi feito, do que foi falado, e para eles realmente sanou essa expectativa, foi de frente, foi de encontro com o que o CMA estava esperando, uma vez que a preocupação maior do CMA era que, dessa vez, na compra, né, a Microsoft com o Xbox, com todos, né, com o sistema de nuvem, o Xbox, o Windows, teria muito poder também na aquisição da Activision Blizzard, e isso para eles não era interessante, algo que a gente sabe que não é bem isso que aconteceu. Afinal de contas, no começo, o CMA estava muito disposto a conversar a respeito da Sony apenas, né, dos jogos de Xbox, e a coisa depois caiu pro cloud. Enfim, dessa forma, ela comentou positivamente que espera, né, agora uma concretização rápida, porque atendeu sim as expectativas do que estava acontecendo. Por outro lado, a senhora Cordell, do CMA, comentou também uma coisa muito importante, dizendo que a partir de agora eles esperam, né, o CMA espera que outras empresas que estão fazendo compras e fusões já enviem a sua proposta mais perfeita dentro das expectativas possível, para que eles economizem tempo e dinheiro na sua avaliação. Mas até aí também nenhuma empresa vai colocar já todas as cartas na mesa, eles vão passar pela aprovação, pelas aprovações em etapas. Eles vão colocando aquilo que eles acham que é interessante e vão vendo a resposta do regulador. Ninguém vai chegar, a Microsoft não ia chegar logo de primeira e falar assim: olha, a gente está comprando e está aqui a nossa proposta, a gente vai colocar tudo na mão da Activision, tudo da Activision Blizzard na mão da Ubisoft para jogos em nuvem. Não, isso não ia acontecer. A Microsoft ia explorar o máximo possível, ter poder de tudo que eles estão comprando antes de dar poder a uma outra empresa. E no geral, até gostei bastante das perguntas que a jornalista da Bloomberg fez. Até uma hora ela comentou ali se realmente o CMA, né, com essa postura que eles estavam tendo, estava demonstrando ao mundo que eles não estavam abertos para negociação. Ou seja, o Reino Unido com os seus 4 países, ali 3 países e meio, fazem parte desse todo do CMA, estavam meio que preocupados de que empresas estavam saindo do país, empresas de tecnologia, na sua grande maioria, poderiam sair do país, porque o CMA demonstrou nesse processo com a Microsoft que a coisa realmente não estavam felizes e não iriam aprovar nada desse tipo. Isso é um problema para o mercado. E aí Sarah Connor falou que não é assim que funciona a coisa. Vou tirar um pouquinho das costas ou da reta, né? Mas no fundo parecia isso aí, né? No mais, os vídeos falam por si só, espero que vocês tenham gostado. Qualquer coisa, deixem seus comentários aí que a gente vai trocando aquela ideia. Eu sou o LEOIZZO, vou ficando por aqui, logo mais tem mais vídeos. Beijo no coração de vocês, fui!